What did Chris learn out at First Pitch Arizona? Find out next on Fantasy Baseball Today in 5. Welcome into FBT in 5 on Tuesday, November 5th. I am Frank Stampfl, joined by Chris Towers, who just recently returned from First Pitch Arizona, which is this extravagant weekend fantasy baseball conference where a bunch of people meet up. There's panels and there's live podcasts, and you go out and watch games in the Arizona Fall League. So we're going to learn about some of the things that Chris learned while he was out there. First up, Bryce Miller introduced a knuckle curve midseason that helped propel his breakout. He also had a 30% strikeout rate at home compared to 18% on the road. Chris, those final 15 starts once he introduced the curveball were fantastic. And I guess the home road splits are not surprising because the strikeout park factor for Seattle is like off the charts. Like they are number one. So I guess that is not overly exciting for Bryce Miller.
Yeah, I think the reason I point out the home road split there is it just feels inevitable that the Mariners are going to trade one of their starting pitchers. Now, I'm not sure Bryce Miller would be at the top of the list if I was going to be making that decision. I'd rather move Luis Castillo and the money he's owed. Think I'd rather move Brian Wu and the injury concerns there. Miller doesn't seem to have many injury concerns, but obviously moving from a fantastic home park to anywhere else would be probably tough for a guy who I do think has a somewhat slim margin for error. When Bryce Miller gets hit hard, when he gets hit, he tends to get hit really hard. And what we've seen in his career is a lot of tinkering, and that's pretty standard for the Mariners. That these guys have all, seems everybody in their rotations pretty much has added a splitter in the past year, and that was a big part of Bryce Miller getting off to a hot start this year. But he was still lacking east-west movement. He's got the splitter that drops, but slider and sweeper still haven't been effective pitches for him. Knuckle curve started to be that. It was his best whiff pitch by far. I think it was a 39% whiff rate when he threw it. Started throwing it around late June, like you said. There was one start in mid-August he talked about. I read an interview on Fangraphs where he talked about he struck out the side with it after not throwing it at all in the first 6 innings of the game. So like that, if you're looking for a way that Bryce Miller could continue his second half breakout, I think more emphasis on that curveball could be one way to get there.
Next up, Nick Pollack and Eric Smolsky from Pitcher List. They were doing a podcast talking about, their starting pitcher rankings.
Yeah, the On the Corner podcast.
And they have Jacob deGrom, Shane McClanahan, and Shohei Ohtani all in their top 8 starting pitchers for next season. All 3 are also returning from a second major elbow surgery in their career. So what do you think of the aggressiveness here?
I'm not that aggressive, but I can definitely see the case for it. And I think, to their credit, the argument, I think, ultimately comes down to we don't know who's going to stay healthy. We know most pitchers aren't going to stay healthy, or at least a significant portion of them. Let's just rank based on who we think is the most talented. And if those guys are right and back to their pre-injury form, and we did at least get to see a glimpse of it with Jacob deGrom, I don't think you can argue that they're among the 10 best pitchers in baseball. It's just with deGrom and especially McClanahan, since we didn't see him pitch this year, can you bet on him being that guy again? I think it's possible, but after what we saw with Walker Buehler, I'm wary of making that bet with Shane McClanahan. I think it's really interesting. The two really, really smart analysts have him that high because it means I'm probably not going to be drafting Shane McClanahan. I think I have him somewhere more 30 to 40. I think there's upside, but it's just, there's a lot of ways for things to go wrong. So I think it highlights maybe a philosophical difference there. And who knows, they very well may be right. I don't feel comfortable betting against guys who are that talented, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of guys that are talented, Eno Saris updated his Stuff Plus model, and Garrett Crochet and Paul Skenes had the biggest jump and are arguably the 2 best pitchers based on that model. Paul Skenes is going to be drafted likely as a top 3 pitcher, But Chris, as we start to hear the rumblings about Garrett Crochet being traded, if he goes to a better team, we don't have to worry about innings restrictions or anything like that. He's a name that I could see skyrocketing, once we get to like February and March.
Yeah, it was interesting. Garrett Crochet might have been the single most discussed player at First Pitch Arizona, from what I could tell. A ton of panels, a ton of podcasts talking about him, and his ADP in very early NFBC drafts, and then some draft and holds and stuff like that. He's been around 55 in the ADP, and I feel like it was either, yes, I would draft him there every single time I'm picking, it doesn't matter who I've taken, or it was I wouldn't take him until it was 50 picks later, and there was no in between. And I'm definitely more along the lines of the former. I think Garrett Crochet should be a top 50 pick. I think you could make a case for him as high as 6. And I know Nick Pollock also has Garrett Crochet as his number 3 SP for the season, and he is one of the smartest pitching and analysts out there. So I think that tells you how talented Garrett Crochet is viewed by a lot of people in the industry. And the arguments against drafting him, I think, are, health and how will he hold up after a gigantic innings jump. He hadn't thrown more than, I think, 70 innings in a season ever before getting to 144 last year. So that's a concern. And then the team he plays on. But I think a trade is all but certain. And hey, if we're going to draft Jacob deGrom as a top 12 pitcher, Garrett Crochet might just be better at this point in their careers without taking into account injury risks. So I think Garrett Crochet is at least a top 15 and probably a top 10 starting pitcher for 2025.
All right. For more extensive fantasy baseball coverage, listen to the Fantasy Baseball Today podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Thanks for listening to Fantasy Baseball Today in 5, and we will be back again on Thursday. Bye-bye.